Every once in a while, a card or mechanic gets printed that completely changes how Magic is played. Either because they finally give a deck a piece they've been missing, or because they blank entire strategies. These cards have redefined Magic as we know it, and today we're going to go over the cards that have had the biggest impact on the game of Magic. Starting us off at number 10, we have Nicol Bolas. This is a 7/7 legendary Elder Dragon with a mana cost of 2, 2 blue, 2 black, and 2 red. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by flyers or reach creatures, and it has the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice him unless you pay 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red. Finally, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards their hand. This card is actually part of a cycle of 5 Elder Dragons. The name Elder Dragon might be familiar to some people as it's the namesake of the Elder Dragon Highlander, possibly more well known as Commander. These 5 dragons were the beginning of what is now the most popular format of all of Magic. Originally, these were the only creatures that could be the head of your deck commander, though over time the format grew to accept more ways of playing as its popularity grew and grew. In fact, we can still see some of the vestiges of their influence in the format. Commander damage is the mechanic where, if a player takes 21 combat damage from a single commander, they lose the game. The reason the number is exactly 21 is because, originally, the rule was that if someone's commander hit you 3 times, you lost the game. This resulted in exactly 21 damage, which ended up being a good bar to make it achievable with other cards, but not as easy as hitting them with your 1 mana legendary creature 3 times. The reason I chose Bolas to represent the cycle is because it arguably still has the biggest niche when combined with Scion of the Ur-Dragon. This is a 5 mana dragon with the ability where you can pay 2 to search your library for a dragon permanent card, put it into your graveyard, shuffle, and then Scion becomes a copy of it until the end of the turn. This allows you to attack with Scion, turn it into Nicol Bolas after blockers are declared, and then force them to discard their entire hand. Now, while these cards haven't really had that big of an impact on competitive Magic, their impact on the overall Magic scene is still among the highest of any card. And at number 9, we have Stoneforge Mystic. This is a 1/2 core artificer with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. It has the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for an equipment card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. You can also pay 1 and 1 white to tap it to put an equipment card in your hand onto the battlefield. Mystic is a card that has completely redefined how equipments were used. You see, there are a lot of very strong equipment like Batterskull and Cauldron Complete, both of which happen to have the extremely strong living weapon keyword. This means that whenever they enter the battlefield, you create a 0/0 black Phyrexian germ creature token and attach the equipment to it, meaning these equipments are basically creatures by themselves. This lets Stoneforge basically represent a huge threat all on its own. But what makes Stoneforge so important is how its ability redefines every equipment in Magic. Every equipment has to be evaluated with the knowledge that you can search it off and cheat it out with Stoneforge. Whenever new equipment gets printed, people don't just see new cards that can build with it, they also see new Stoneforge targets. And basically every deck that runs equipment runs Stoneforge, even Hammer Time, whose namesake card, Colossus Hammer, doesn't benefit that much from Stoneforge. However, being able to find it whenever you want, and being able to tutor out other equipment whenever they're at their most useful makes Stoneforge an auto-include for the deck. Stoneforge was so good it was actually banned in Modern for many years. Considering the card's long continued history of success and how it redefined an entire subtype of card, Stoneforge absolutely earns a spot on this list. And at number 8, we have Jace the Mind Sculptor. This is a 3 loyalty planeswalker with a mana cost of 2 and 2 blue. It has abilities where you can +2 him to look at the top card of a target player's library, then put it on the top or bottom of the library. You can 0 him to draw 3 cards, and then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library. You can -1 him to bounce target creature, and finally you can -12 him to exile target player's library, then make them shuffle their hand into the library. Jace is on here representing planeswalkers as a card type, a somewhat recent addition to the game that has completely changed the way the game has been played. In his time, Jace was considered the strongest planeswalker, seeing play all the way back in Vintage and being banned in his standard format and in Modern for years. While Jace himself has certainly had a huge impact, the invention of the planeswalker card type caused an even greater shift. In the past, the best way for control decks to end the game was to play a card like Aetherling. These expensive, sticky control threats defined the game for years, until planeswalkers slowly became more common. Slowly, they replaced these big, expensive threats as the most common win condition for control, coming down in the mid-game to generate value, and often ended up winning the game with their ultimates if you manage to protect them long enough. It's fairly common to see control decks in Standard relying on planeswalkers to close games for them, as their abilities can often be more useful than a creature will be. Jace and his ilk have slowly wormed their way into basically every fair strategy in Magic, with walkers being nearly ubiquitous in mid-range and control strategies across multiple formats. And at number 7, we have Burning Wish. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has the effect where you reveal a sorcery card from your sideboard and put it into your hand, then you exile Burning Wish. This card is a member of a whole cycle, and it's probably been the most consistently successful one besides possibly Living Wish. The ability to have access to sideboard cards in the first game of the match has proven to be far, far more useful than it may seem at first. One use for them is allowing you to hide your combo pieces from lobotomy effects. Cards like Surgical Extraction have been used to stop combo decks in their tracks for years. But if one of your 4 copies of a card is in your sideboard, Surgical won't be able to do anything about it. This is why decks like Storm and Legacy have used the card to find their Storm cards to end the game during their combo turn. Another very common use was to basically just grab useful cards whenever they'd be best used in a matchup. One card that's been used to do this to great effect was the aforementioned Living Wish. Its ability to grab lands and creatures left it much worse as being used for combos, but far better in creating a toolbox. Powerful lock pieces like Collector Oof and Sanctum Prelay can just be grabbed out of the sideboard against opponents who will have a hard time dealing with them. Sure, this is a lot worse than just drawing the card and casting it, but the upside of just having such a versatile sideboard is very high. In a way, playing with wishes gives you 4 copies of every one of the targets in your sideboard. This means you can have a good chance of drawing them without having to actually put 4 copies of the card into your deck. The end result is basically being able to have your cake and eat it too when it comes to your sideboard slots. You can consistently draw the sideboard cards you want, while still having 10 or so different sideboard cards. The Wish cycles single-handedly introduce an entirely new type of deck building to Magic, quite literally changing how people approach the game. And at number 6, we have Griselbrand. This is a 7/7 legendary demon with a mana cost of 4 and 4 black. It has flying and lifelink, meaning any amount of damage it deals also causes you to gain that much life. It has the ability where you can pay 7 life to draw 7 cards. This card is obviously very strong, but actually paying 8 mana to cast it is a very large task. However, if you can get even a single turn with Griselbrand on the battlefield, you can often simply win the game. As a result, as soon as the card was printed, people started finding ways to cheat onto the battlefield as soon as possible. From reanimation to cards like Show and Tell, every method that could be used to cheat Griselbrand out was, and in fact, was usually more than enough to win the game. People would use cards like Goryo's Vengeance, which allows you to reanimate a legendary creature, but only for 1 turn, and gives it haste. Then, they would draw as many cards as they wanted and repeatedly cast Fury of the Horde, a 0-mana card that lets you take an extra combat and repeatedly attack with Griselbrand until you win the game. This card was so influential that Wizards started designing around the card. When they wanted to put a Reanimator deck into Modern, the 2 cards they designed to facilitate the strategy, Persist and Unmarked Grave, both specified non-legendary creature in order to specifically stop the card to work with Griselbrand. Before Griselbrand, these decks built around cheating out creatures had tons of different options they would choose between. But after Griselbrand came out, it was either him or Emrakul. The degree to which Griselbrand has warped the game around him is pretty severe, considering the only use for the card is a payoff for people to cheat him into play. And at number 5, we have the Golgari Grave-Troll. This is a 0/0 troll skeleton with a mana cost of 4 and 1 green. It has Dredge 6, meaning when you draw a card, if it's in your graveyard, you can instead mill 6 cards and return it from the graveyard to your hand. It enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it for each creature card in your graveyard, and you can pay 1 and remove a +1/+1 counter from Grave-Troll to regenerate it, meaning the next time it would be destroyed this turn, you instead remove all damage from it, tap it, and remove it from combat. However, if you know anything about this card, you'll know those abilities basically never matter. You see, there are quite a few cards in Magic that can function out of the graveyard, such as Necroamoeba, which reanimates itself when it's milled, or Ikorid, which reanimates itself at the beginning of your next upkeep if you exile a black creature card from your graveyard. This means that if you could find a way to mill enough cards quickly enough, you could quickly assemble an entire board for no mana at all. This led to decks where, rather than actually playing a normal game of Magic, players would just use cards like Faithless Looting or Breakthrough to draw and discard a huge number of cards very quickly, allowing you to dredge upwards of 20 cards in a turn. This would let you do a ton of damage, but even better, this was really hard to interact with. Most of the deck's threats could just come back next turn, so most forms of removal just wouldn't work against the deck. You really needed a card like Anger of the Gods or Rest in Peace to actually slow the deck down. As soon as the Dredge mechanic was released, Dredge decks started popping up in basically every format where the card was legal. Now, this spot on this list could have been Bazaar Baghdad, a card that's famously broken in graveyard strategies and has done a lot to enable them for years in Vintage, even variants without Dredge cards. However, since the card is banned everywhere except for Vintage, the Dredge mechanic is taking the spot for enabling really broken graveyard-based decks, since their impact on the game was overall higher. And at number 4, we have Millstone. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It has the ability where you can pay 2 and tap Millstone to have target player mill 2 cards. This card is honestly pretty bad, but the ripples of its legacy have not only gone through all of Magic, but through all of trading card games in general. In fact, the reason that taking cards from the top of your library and putting them into your graveyard is called milling in Magic, and in most other card games, is explicitly a reference to this card. Millstone birthed the very first mill deck, which aimed to simply stall out the game with various removal spells, counter spells, and walls to stall the game as long as possible, and slowly mill their deck by activating Millstone over and over. This birthed an entire archetype of deck, the mill deck, and in fact, this was the first time that any deck had a win condition that wasn't simply dealing 20 damage to your opponent. Wizards would repeatedly print cards with these kinds of effects afterwards, as it was something of a hit with the player base. No matter how bad they were, anytime a card like this popped up in Standard, people would try to make a mill deck work. And while mill decks did have their fans, there were tons of players who found them very annoying. No one wanted to have to mill their own deck, watching their favorite cards go to the graveyard before they ever got a chance to use them. Regardless of the somewhat controversial status of the mechanic, Millstone will remain a huge part of the game's history. And at number 3, we have Blood Moon. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It is the effect where all non-basic lands are mountains. Released all the way back in the dark, this was the first card that really punished greedy mana bases in Magic. A greedy mana base is a term for whenever a deck is relying heavily on lots of non-basics to allow them to play 3 or more colors. However, as soon as Blood Moon comes down, all those lands will only be tapping for red mana. This will usually make it so that they can't do anything. At that point, you've usually just won the game. Most decks in older formats play so few basics that drawing into them to turn their spells back on is fairly unlikely. As a result, people will often try to find their basic lands early on against an opponent who they're suspecting is playing Blood Moon, or hold up mana to use a removal spell as soon as it resolves. The impact this card has on the format is so severe that without it, or more recent cards that do a similar job, most formats will be overrun with 4 or 5 color decks that would all play mostly the same cards. Before we finish, we also need to mention Wasteland. This is a land that you can tap for a colorless and tap and sacrifice to destroy target non-basic land. Wasteland does the same thing as Blood Moon in the format it's legal in, but since it's only legal in Legacy and Vintage, Blood Moon was chosen over it for this list. And at number 2, we have Fetchlands. These are a cycle of 10 lands, 1 for each 2 color combination. They each have the ability where you can pay 1 life, tap, and sacrifice them to search your library for a land with one of the 2 basic land types and put it into the battlefield. Now, when these cards were first printed, they were considered pretty underwhelming in most circumstances. That was until the Shocklands were printed. These were a cycle of 10 lands that all had 2 of the 5 basic land types and entered the battlefield tapped unless you pay 2 life. The reason this was so important is that it allowed you to essentially find any color you wanted off of a fetch land. Let's say your deck had Temple Garden, or Breeding Pool, or Overgrown Tomb, and Stomping Ground in it. With that setup, any fetch land that could find Forest could find any of the 4 Shocklands, and then you find any color you wanted. Now, most decks didn't play this many colors, but it was very easy for 3 or even 4 color decks to make sure they got all of their colors. The fetch lands being able to find lands with these basic land types is so important that some cards are made incredibly strong just because they're fetchable. For instance, Mystic Sanctuary is a card that ended up being pretty broken specifically because it had the island type. Basically, this was a land that entered untapped if you had 3 or more other islands. And when it hit the field, if it entered untapped, you put an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. Being able to fetch this card ended up being a huge problem, as you could basically just choose to draw whatever instant or sorcery they wanted in the late game. Another place where the power of being able to fetch non-basics really shine is in Triomes. These are lands that are always enter tap and can be cycled for 3 mana, but they have 3 basic land types. These lands have already seen heavy played modern in all matter of 3, 4, or even 5 color decks. However, the original Tri-lands barely saw any play. Simply being able to fetch them whenever you wanted made them a huge boon to mana bases. Fetch lands are the backbone of any half-decent multicolor mana base in older formats, but there's still one card that's possibly more influential. And at number 1, we have Force of Will. This is an instant with a mana cost of 3 and 2 blue. It is the effect where you counter target spell, but you can also cast the card without paying its mana cost by exiling a blue card from your hand and paying 1 life. This was the first, and still maybe the best, 0 mana counter spell in all of Magic. And without it, formats like Legacy and Vintage would be virtually unplayable. You see, Legacy and Vintage have a ton of decks that can pretty consistently win the game on turn 1. And if you're going second, that means you won't even be able to play a land before your opponent kills you. Now, the only real way to counteract this is with 0 mana interaction, of which by far the most common is Force of Will. If Force of Will didn't exist to regulate these formats, they'd each have to have a ban list a mile long to stop the litany of extremely fast and strong combos from taking over. Force of Will is so iconic that when Wizards decided to make a new cycle of pitch spells, they called them Forces. Force still has an impact on the game outside of the first few turns, of course. Later on in the game, players need to keep track of the cards in their opponent's hand to see how likely it is they might have a Force up, even if all of their mana is tapped. While Force is contained to only a couple of formats, the impact it has on them is so vast that it easily takes number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down below in the comment.